Joshua 12, verse 7 to 24, records the kings defeated by Joshua and the children of Israel west of the Jordan. At first glance, this passage appears to be little more than a historical list of conquered rulers. Yet it serves as a testimony to God's faithfulness, the completion of his promises, and the establishment of his kingdom among his covenant people. The record of victory. Joshua 12, 7 to 8 says that Joshua defeated kings from Lebanon in the north to Mount Halak in the south and distributed the land to the tribes of Israel. The emphasis is not merely on military success, but on the fulfillment of God's covenant with Abraham. Open quote, "Unto thy seed have I given this land." Genesis 15:18, close quote. By the time Joshua conquered these kings, God's promise was becoming visible reality. The victories were not ultimately won by Israel's strength, but by God's faithfulness. Earlier, Joshua had reminded the people, open quote, "One man of you shall chase 1,000. For the Lord your God, he it is that fighteth for you." Joshua 23, verse 10. Close quote. The kingdom was not earned. It was received as an inheritance. The defeated kings, Joshua 12, 9 to 24 lists 31 kings. Their names are significant because they represent the complete overthrow of the old order that opposed God's purposes. Throughout Scripture, hostile kings often symbolize worldly powers that exalt themselves against God. The defeat of these rulers demonstrates that no earthly authority can permanently resist his plan. The repetition of "the king of," followed by each city, creates a rhythm that emphasizes completeness. One by one, every obstacle fell. The king of Jericho, the king of Ai, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Lachish, the king of Hazor, and so on until 31 kings had been conquered. Nothing remained unconquered that God had promised to Israel. God's faithfulness to his covenant. This chapter is essentially a victory ledger. Ancient nations kept records of military triumphs to glorify their rulers. Joshua 12 does something different. The attention is directed toward God's faithfulness rather than Joshua's greatness. Earlier, Moses had warned Israel that they should never think, open quote, "My power and the might of mine hand hath gotten me this wealth." Deuteronomy 8, verse 17. Close quote. Joshua 12 quietly reminds the reader that every victory belonged to God. The chapter anticipates Joshua's later declaration. Open quote, "Not one thing hath failed of all the good things which the Lord your God spake concerning you." Joshua 23, 14. Close quote. The kingdom established. The conquest of Canaan marked the establishment of God's covenant kingdom in the land. The enemies who had occupied the inheritance were removed so God's people could dwell in peace. The prophets would later use similar language to describe the coming reign of the Messiah, where all enemies would be subdued and God's kingdom would fill the earth. The victories of Joshua point beyond themselves to a greater and lasting kingdom that would not depend on military conquest, but on God's redemptive work through Christ. Christ as the greater Joshua. The Hebrew name Joshua is the same name as Jesus, meaning the Lord saves. Joshua led Israel into their promised inheritance. Jesus leads his people into the fullness of God's promises. Joshua defeated earthly kings. Christ triumphs over every spiritual enemy. The New Testament declares, open quote, "Having spoiled principalities and powers, he made a shoe of them openly, triumphing over them in it." Colossians 2:15. Close quote. The long list of defeated kings in Joshua 12 foreshadows the complete triumph of Christ over every opposing power. The end of the old order. Many of the cities listed in Joshua 12 would later become centers of Israel's history. Jerusalem, Hebron, Bethel, and Hazor would all play important roles in the unfolding covenant story. Yet the ultimate purpose of these victories was not merely territorial possession, but the unfolding of God's redemptive plan, culminating in the establishment of the new covenant kingdom. The old covenant system, with its land, temple, and national boundaries, served its purpose in preparing for a greater reality. The inheritance promised through Christ extends beyond a geographical territory to a kingdom that embraces his people from every nation. The conquest under Joshua anticipated the complete establishment of God's reign, where his promises would find their ultimate fulfillment. Lessons from the 31 kings. The repeated phrase, "one after each king," underscores an important truth. No enemy was overlooked. No battle was forgotten. Every victory mattered because every victory testified to God's faithfulness. Joshua 12 reminds readers that God's promises move steadily toward fulfillment. What he begins, he completes. The chapter stands as a monument to divine faithfulness. 31 defeated kings become 31 witnesses that God keeps his word. What appears to be a simple historical register is actually a celebration of covenant fulfillment, the establishment of God's kingdom, and a foreshadowing of the greater victory accomplished through Jesus Christ, whose reign secures an everlasting inheritance that cannot be conquered or taken away.